like I said, I love this class. And you kind of have to do a class on the Renaissance. Um, you have to. There's no getting around it. And I really wanted to do a class that shows that the Renaissance is worth the hype, but not for the reasons that you might expect. So first we're going to cover basically the reasons why the Renaissance is famous, and then we're going to cover the more reasons why the Renaissance should really be famous. By Renaissance, we are generally talking about works of art from the 1400s to the 1600s. Am I saying that right? Yes. Everything in the 1400s is normally termed the early Renaissance, and everything in the 1500s up to 1600 is normally termed the high Renaissance. And we'll get into that a bit later. One of the first things that the Renaissance is famous for is for its revival of classical architecture. We looked at classical architecture in the very first class, and we talked about the three different types of column: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, which is the flowery one. And you can see immediately in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which I'm sure some of you will have been to, that they have totally copied, like inch for inch, or whatever the saying is, the Corinthian columns of the Renaissance. And it really was that exact, like they copied the measurements of classical architecture really, really, really precisely. This is the Pantheon in Rome, which inspired St. Peter's Basilica. So you can see what's happened here. The Romans copied the Greeks, and Renaissance architects copied the Romans and the Greeks. So it was just a long series of copying. But you'll see in this class that it wasn't necessarily unimaginative copying. It wasn't just pure repetition. And we will get to that. This is a reminder of the first class for some of you. The three columns that we looked at and the different symbols and meanings that they have. You can go back to the first class and remember that the Doric was a symbol of strength, which is why it's quite brutal and basic looking. Ionic was more scholarly, and Corinthian was more decorative, which is why it's often seen on like triumphal arches. But these were copied exactly by Renaissance artists. And that's the first thing to really note about the Renaissance. The second thing that is famous, I suppose, in the Renaissance is the sculpture, specifically the copies of classical sculpture, Greek and Roman sculpture. We have looked at some before, so I'm going to start off with this. We've looked at Michelangelo's David and how he tried to create this perfect classical man by copying Greek and Roman sculpture as much as he could. But what I wanted to stress is that Michelangelo went beyond classical sculpture because he started to actually incorporate facial expressions, very subtle facial expressions into his sculpture. So you can see here that Michelangelo has a furrowed brow, which was really quite radical at the time, if you think about the kind of sculptures that they were digging up. And I must stress as well that they were really digging up things in the Renaissance. They were archaeologists, you know, and it was absolutely the most exciting thing. And lots of Renaissance writers write texts about going to see these archaeological finds and just being completely in awe. And this is what led people to really self-define the era as the Renaissance, the rebirth, like a really important moment in history, quite self-consciously. So Laocoon, which is this sculpture here, was actually discovered, I think it was discovered in 1501 or something. It was dug up. So it just gives you a sense of, and it would have been mad for Renaissance artists to find a sculpture like that, to see this unbelievable representation of a human body. It would have, of course, it completely transformed how they started representing the body. And Renaissance sculptures were the first freestanding sculptures like sculptures that stand alone since classical times. You do obviously get sculptures of saints in the medieval period, but they're often on buildings. They're not really meant to stand alone. They're meant to be understood in a cathedral context. Whereas Renaissance sculptures, for the first time, were meant to be standalone figures. So super radical for the time. And this like transition towards freestanding sculptures is symptomatic of this new interest in humans, this turn away from pure religious interests, this turn away from God towards actually finding yourself interesting, which changed everything. And it's almost, I said when I first filmed this class, it's almost like we've never recovered from the Renaissance. Like people have never once gone back to being, well, people. The earth at large, I don't think has gone back to being as spiritual ever again after the Renaissance. Massive sweeping statement, but at least in the West, the obsession with the self that was born in this period, it's like we never got over it, I feel sometimes, but you can tell me your thoughts. Okay, so these should be familiar to you. The other sculptures that should be familiar to you that we've looked at before in the class are Michelangelo's slaves. I mentioned when I think it was in the class on sculpture, that Michelangelo believed that he was, I mean, hilariously, considering I've just said that the Renaissance was a turn away from God, Michelangelo believed that he was divinely inspired and that it was his God-given duty. He thought that his figures lived inside the marble and that it was his duty to cut them out. So he didn't sculpt by making a broad shape first. He basically sculpted from front to back. And you have to imagine it's like someone sitting in a bath and the water draining out. That's how Michelangelo sculpted. And that's why he's seen as this unbelievably talented, inspired figure. And he left so many of his sculptures unfinished. And it's amazing because they're so, I think, so much more beautiful when they're left like stuck within the stone. And lots of later sculptors like Rodin in the 20th century have tried to copy this effect of figures coming out of the marble. So I just wanted to include these because even though the Renaissance is famous for its very classical sculpture, you do get these strangely modern looking sculptures coming out, like almost abstract. And then the final thing that will be familiar to you in terms of, you know, places in which we've touched upon the Renaissance before is these drawings. So we talked briefly, I think, in the class on paper about how, actually you won't be able to see this name, about how these big Renaissance artists like Titian, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, who are kind of the four big names, had very, very, very different styles of drawing, even though sometimes we think of the Renaissance as this one big lump of style. Actually, you can see that, I mean, Titian draws almost like an abstract artist, which is absolutely mad. Whereas Michelangelo is much more interested in the movement of the body and being very precise about the anatomy. And so is Leonardo. He was very interested in aging and the process of aging. And you have to remember that just like I said, they were digging up archaeological discoveries, people were also starting to dig up bodies because this new fascination with the body, which was brought on by sculptures like Laocoon, which you can kind of understand because it's this mad body, led people to dig up graves and conduct, what do you call it, like basically to study anatomy, which was illegal, but they did it anyway, especially Leonardo, to try and learn exactly how the body was, which fits the argument of this self-obsession, not necessarily in a bad way, more like self-fascination. So you get a sense here of each of their different approaches. Each big artist fits into the Renaissance for a different reason. But I wanted to talk more about this, how can I call it, breaking down the Renaissance, like challenging this lump, this idea that the Renaissance is just this big lump of one style, because it's actually not. And oh, this is a great example, actually. I wanted to compare a Titian painting with a Michelangelo painting, both big, important Renaissance paintings, and you can see just how different they are. For all the reasons that I've just described, Michelangelo was obviously more interested in the body. He was also more interested in God, whereas Titian was more interested in mythology, again, because of this revival of classicism. And he was also more interested in color and texture than the body. And a lot of people actually say that that's because Titian was a Venetian artist, and because of the way Venice is, because of the lights and the water, it just gave this very, very different color and palette to Venetian Renaissance artists. Whereas Michelangelo and Leonardo and Raphael, who are more kind of precise in their style, are normally from Rome and Florence, different region, where there was more classical architecture, and maybe it lent itself to this more precise style. So next time you go into a Renaissance gallery, firstly, from the first point, try and spot elements of classical architecture that they've painted in the background, for example. Secondly, try and spot the detail in the human figures, maybe even some freestanding human figures. And then try and differentiate, try and break down the style, like, I don't know, think about the differences between artists instead of considering them all to be the same style, because there actually loads of differences will emerge. Anyway, this was a tangent. The main stylistic division you need to learn if you want to break down the Renaissance is the North and the South. This is the traditional breakdown of the Renaissance amongst art history. The South, i.e. Italy, gets all the attention. So when you think about the Renaissance, you'll definitely be thinking about Italian artists. But in the north of Europe, you get artists like Dürer, who are producing these woodcuts, which are also very famous Renaissance works, even though they look completely different to anything we've looked at so far in this Renaissance class. And there's lots of speculation as to why the Northern Renaissance looks so different. Some people say it's because in the North, instead of coming from this tradition of classical Greece and Rome, they came from a tradition, a more medieval style tradition of manuscript painting. So they make art in this very, very precise and very linear way, almost as if they were doing calligraphy, because they just come from this different context. But even though the style manifests very differently, the Northern Renaissance still fits into this broader Renaissance theme of becoming interested in the human. So Dürer's praying hands are a really great example of this. And actually one of you sent it to me as one of your favorite works of art. And it's so beautiful. And it really proves the point, because it's, instead of showing who is praying, instead of showing the divine figure, Dürer's actually chosen to zoom in on the anatomy, on the veins of the hands, almost like objectifying the person praying, and asking people to focus on like the physical aspect of praying as opposed to the spiritual aspect, which is radical for the time, like super, super radical. And here you have a comparison of one of Dürer's famous woodcuts and Michelangelo's, you know, famous snippet from the Sistine Chapel. And I've put these together because they were made in exactly the same year, which is crazy. It's such a shocking comparison. And an exercise that art historians often do is to use these paintings to write an essay as a starting point for the differences between the Northern and the Southern Renaissance. But it's also interesting to think about the similarities, because there are some. If you think about the way that the bodies are falling in both pictures, like the weight of the bodies for the first time, you know, like when you think of an altarpiece, you have these very static, weightless, kind of floaty figures. But here you can finally see that artists are like considering the weight of their bodies, like this falling man and the kind of limp hands in both paintings basically speak to this new interest in the body, I would say. If you want to learn more about the Northern Renaissance, Lucas Cranach the Elder is such a good place to start. He's a super interesting artist, but he epitomizes the Northern Renaissance because of the amount of detail, basically, in his paintings, especially when it comes to the landscape. And this is one of the main differences. When you look at a Southern Renaissance painting, if there is a background, it will normally be classical looking, whereas the Northern Renaissance, they put so much detail into their landscapes, which really speaks to the different part of the world that they were in, you know, like forests up in the north of Europe. This is another painting that one of you sent me as well, which was one of your favorite Northern Renaissance paintings, and it's absolutely beautiful, very close to where I am right now, the Ghent altarpiece, and again has that kind of level of detail in terms of the fabrics and the flooring and the crowns and the landscapes that you might not see in an Italian Renaissance painting that's more interested in just the body. So this actually is a comparison between Lucas Cranach the Younger and Raphael. So you've got the Northern Renaissance on the left and the Southern Renaissance on the right. And you can just see in this comparison how one landscape is just so much more cluttered than the other. You know, Raphael's landscape is essentially a blue sky, whereas the Northern Renaissance Crucifixion just has so much going on. So next time as well, you're in a gallery, you can try and pick out which paintings are from the Northern Renaissance and which paintings are from the Southern Renaissance. And it's a super interesting exercise as well, because then you can think about how different contexts shape artists, how different landscapes actually can transform a whole style. It's super, super interesting. I'm just checking I haven't missed anything about the Northern Renaissance. I haven't actually. We're now going to go on to talk about Van Eyck, who, this will be familiar as well to some of you because we talked about him in the class on portraiture. Oh, hang on, I've just lost the chat. I'm going to try and get it back. There we go. So we've talked about Van Eyck before, and you will recognize some of the images that I'm about to show you. But I wanted to include one that we haven't seen before, which is his Virgin on the left-hand side, and compare it to a Southern Renaissance Italian painting to make the same comparison, basically. You can see that one is much more sparse than the other in terms of everything, in terms of the landscape, in terms of the flooring, in terms of the architecture, in terms of the clothes that, you know, like the fabrics that the Virgin Mary is wearing, the crown that the angel is holding. It's just so much more elaborate in the north. And you can see that these paintings are basically at the same time, made at the same time. However, there are similarities emerging. Like you can see that actually Van Eyck has included the same Corinthian columns as the Italian artist. And this is something that you will see more and more as we progress in the Renaissance. These northern and southern styles start to fuse more, and that's because you get the invention of the printing press around this time. Artists start to travel more, and engravings are being exchanged and copied, and these styles basically start to come together slowly. This is the painting by Van Eyck that we've studied before in the portraiture class, which is the very famous Marriage of Arnolfini in the National Gallery. And the detail in this painting is just unreal, and it's so Northern Renaissance in that sense. Like the mirror even has scenes from the Passion of Christ around it. You know, everything is a symbol: the oranges, the shoes, the dog, the materials. But that's not why I actually included this painting in this particular class. I included this painting because it says a lot about the Renaissance, because in the mirror, you will be able to see that the artist has actually painted himself in the reflection. It's a very, very tiny detail, especially if you see it in person. But this is huge. I mean, this is absolutely huge in the Renaissance, because it shows that it's basically the first time that artists are starting to consider themselves important enough to even include themselves in their paintings. Like even just a century before, artists were very, it was very rare that an artist would even sign their work, let alone paint themselves into the work as if they deserved to be there, you know? So this is another really important thing about the Renaissance. It's a moment when artists start to see themselves as professionals, professional artists who deserve to make money and, well, I suppose more than make money. I suppose this is the moment when they started to think, I'm not just doing this to make money. I'm not just a craftsman. I am something higher, you know? I will paint myself into my paintings. This is sometimes called the first selfie of all time. So just to like recap so far things about the Renaissance, you've got the incorporation of classical architecture, you've got the incorporation of classical sculpture as well, and this leads to a very, very big interest in the human and the human figure. So generally just a new interest in the self, starting slowly to turn away from religion. And so I suppose that it's only natural that the fourth thing to note about the Renaissance would be that the artist starts to take an interest in himself, and I will say him because it is him, not her at this point, which we'll get onto. The fifth thing that we've covered that I actually haven't just summarized is the fact that even though, you know, these are broad characteristics of the Renaissance, you can still break down individual artists and regional styles within this. So this is like a broad summary, but I did want to include, before we move away, just one more example of these kind of increasing fusion, moving away from the north, like fusion northern and southern styles. Because one of the paintings that's most familiar to people, Renaissance paintings, is the Mona Lisa, and actually this is one of the, you know, most famous examples of this fusion, because you can see that the background is very much not an Italian landscape at all, and it's really inspired by these northern Renaissance artists. And Madonna of the Pinks, which is on the right by Raphael, was another image that was sent to me by you, actually, as one of the like favorites of the Renaissance. And I wanted to put it by the Mona Lisa to show that I think Raphael was a bit more reluctant to incorporate anything too northern into his works of art. But I mean, that's up to you to decide next time you see his works in a gallery. but I think they're much more of a traditional Italian Renaissance style, in their kind of simplicity, and the simplicity of his landscapes. But this is something for you to look out for next time. This is a kind of summary page, but it's also taking us on to the next thing. I think I've covered everything in section 1. I have indeed. So, okay, now that we've established these broad characteristics, and feel free to ask questions, I basically wanted to say, now that we know this about the Renaissance, how did we actually get to this point, where you're basically going from the left to the right? So going from something like this to this like vast array of different developments going on at the same time. I've touched upon some of the reasons so far. So the fact that people were doing archaeological digs, anatomical grave digs, or whatever you want to call them, you know, this new interest in the body, and less interest in religion. These are kind of broad explanations, but they're not really enough to explain such a radical transformation in style in just a few decades, to be honest. So this transformation is normally credited in large part to 3 men. It doesn't go to explain anything, but they did make important inventions and developments that you need to know if you want to fully understand the Renaissance. So I will be doing a bit of like reading from my notes, so that we can fully understand who they were. So the first man I'm going to talk about is a man called Brunelleschi, and he is an architect who is said to have discovered perspective, basically. So what he did is he went to these archaeological ruins and he measured them. He measured classical temples, and he created this exact formula that people could use to recreate classical architecture. And he then created a formula that you could use to make your paintings look 3-dimensional, which is still the formula that's used by children and artists today, this kind of triangle, drawing a triangle in your piece of paper to make it look like it's going inwards. This was not known, this was not used before the Renaissance. So, you know, this is why in altarpieces, like religious altarpieces, often you'll have angels on top of each other, and some angels are bigger and some are smaller. It's because artists didn't know how to create depth in their paintings. So the only way that they could create hierarchies is by using big, small, top, bottom. Whereas now you had this whole new world where you could actually create hierarchy by putting people in the foreground and the background in this more naturalistic way. So it was totally, you know, radical. So Brunelleschi, this architect, worked with a sculptor called Donatello, who was the second man credited with this big Renaissance transformation. And Donatello was basically, he's important because he carved the first freestanding sculptures since classical antiquity. You'll notice that these 3 men are all based in the 1400s as opposed to the 1500s. When you get to people like Leonardo and Raphael and Michelangelo, who are more famous, you know, they wouldn't have been able to do what they did had it not been for these inventions in the early Renaissance. And the final man who is credited is a man called Masaccio, who doesn't get enough attention, but he's basically the first artist to use perspective in painting, which is a really huge, huge deal. This next slide is basically an exercise that art historians are asked to do super often, which is a comparison between Donatello's David and Michelangelo's David. And it's supposed to allow you to basically compare the early Renaissance with the high Renaissance. What developments were there? What changed? What stayed the same? You can see that there's a real perfection of anatomy by the high Renaissance, and more of an interest in classicism and all of these things. So this is, you know, if anyone wants to do like a foundational art history exercise, this is a really, really good one. So I've kind of rushed through that, but that's because this is like the textbook Renaissance, you know, Masaccio, Donatello, Brunelleschi, Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael. And this is kind of like trying to understand how we got there. But what I'm more interested in actually is the artists in between, like the artists who kind of straddle medieval and early Renaissance, who are trying to get there, trying to cope with all of these new discoveries and just not quite making it, because they actually produce works of art that are almost look modern, like they look surreal, you know, because they just don't work. Like this painting on the right is one of my favorite paintings, because I love the colors. I mean, I love it as a painting, but it just makes no sense. Like the perspective is totally wrong, but you can see that the artist is really grappling with this new discovery. I mean, look how small the trees are, you know. It doesn't make any sense. But I really like that, because it gives you a sense of how overstimulating this period was for artists. And it's the same with this Virgin, which is by Masaccio. So the man who would end up mastering perspective in paintings. You can see him trying to make it look like the piece of cloth is going backwards, but just not quite succeeding. It still looks super stiff, basically. But these paintings are just, yeah, there's something quite beautiful about them. So I really, yeah, I always try and look for the kind of failures in Renaissance galleries. Someone's just asked me who was the first of the three. And if you're referring to these three kind of typically early Renaissance men, it's Brunelleschi for architecture, Donatello for sculpture, and Masaccio for painting. One of my favorite Renaissance paintings is this Lamentation of Christ from Italy. And it's from 1480, which is mad, but it's so young, this painting, to be such a unusual, original perspective. Like, you know, for someone to decide to paint Christ from his feet is really quite radical, quite disrespectful almost. And it just shows you how artists were starting to become more interested in the physical, I don't know, the physical, whatever you want to call it, composition, than the actual veneration of Christ. And the Virgin crying here on the left is one of the most emotional virgins that you've had so far in the history of art. I mean, even Raphael's virgins that we looked at here are so emotionless, you know. It really takes artists a long time to learn how to study faces. It's something that we really take for granted today, but if you look at these figures, it's so hard to capture a facial expression, and you can see artists really starting to try in this period, which is what makes the Renaissance so interesting, among many other things. And I couldn't help but include Kehinde Wiley's, of course, take on Mantegna's Lamentation of Christ. And you can see that Kehinde Wiley gets the perspective right. You know, Mantegna isn't quite there, not quite right. The feet are too small, and you know, it's not quite there. But it's interesting. It's interesting to see artists failing. Okay, so we've talked about perspective now. We've talked about North and South. We've talked about early versus high. One thing that we haven't touched upon that kind of comes out of all of these developments is portraiture. Because of this new ability to paint naturalistically and this new interest in the human, finally you have portraiture, which is one of my favorite genres, and it really explodes in this period. I wanted to put these three images together because on the left you have an early Renaissance portrait, and on the right, you have more high Renaissance type portraits. And, you know, we've just talked a bit about the difference between early and high, how one is typically stiffer than the other. And this is definitely true in the portraits as well. I mean, you can tell. But what's interesting about this is in the high Renaissance, the only portraits that they really had to copy were portraits on Roman coins that they were finding, which are always have this kind of like very defined side profile. And it's only in the high Renaissance that you see heads starting to turn, and they become more confident to actually depict the front of the face, which is radical again. And the portrait you're seeing on the top right-hand corner is actually a portrait by, a self-portrait by Jan van Eyck, who is this man from The Marriage of Arnolfini. So again, it just goes to show how confident he was, especially for a relatively early Renaissance artist. He was really pioneering, you know, turning the head to this three-quarter profile super early, painting himself. I mean, he's such an important artist when you're talking about the Renaissance. Yeah, such an amazing artist. So, yes, have I missed anything with portraiture? Yeah, there's a lovely quote here actually in my notes. So, the individual artist, the notion of the individual genius, has never been overturned and continues to dominate our definition of art. And this is best exemplified by self-portraits. Just naturally, it's this, not self-obsession, but you have to be somewhat interested in self to paint a self-portrait. And finally, artists were doing this. And it's almost impossible to get across how radical it was to paint yourself, especially if you were a kind of lowly artist. You know, it transformed our understanding of artists. Now we accept that they are these, you know, kind of self-obsessed big figures who earn lots of money, but that really wasn't the case until this moment in history. You know, before they were kind of craftsmen who were dedicated to God, painting altarpieces. It just, I mean, we never looked back, in my opinion. So, oh yeah, I wanted to include Leonardo da Vinci's self-portrait alongside Van Eyck's self-portrait to just give you two examples of two men who pioneered this transformation of the artist, I suppose. But moving on, you know, towards the end of the class, I suppose, there is one thing that we haven't talked about, to my horror, because yeah, it's difficult for me to talk about the Renaissance because there's so much that you have to say, there's so much background that you have to do before you can get to the stuff that I find most interesting. So we're getting to that now. What we haven't talked about so far is women, like no women, no women artists, no nothing. And this sculpture, this amazing sculpture of three women, of the same woman, is kind of like a helpful guide towards getting us there. Firstly, this sculpture perfectly fits all of the themes that we've been talking about, even though it might not look like it at the beginning. It's one woman, basically, and she ages as you go around the sculpture. It's freestanding, obviously, which is one very Renaissance thing. But secondly, the aging, the very like fact of sculpting an aging woman shows this intense interest in humans and like mortality and all of these, you know, things that God-fearing people, I suppose, wouldn't want to like, you know, carve like this. It's such a brutal sculpture. It's absolutely, yeah, it's absolutely insane that this was made in the 1400s. It's just, I mean, it looks so modern, and like even today, artists don't really engage with the taboo of aging very much. And yet you have someone in the 1400s doing it. It's just, it's an absolutely mad sculpture that says so much about this interest in the body. Yeah, it's super interesting. So, okay, do I have to say anything else? Yes, actually. Another important thing about this sculpture that I had in my notes is the nudity, which is, you know, just mind-blowing for this period, the nudity, which was something that artists became comfortable with, again, thanks to classical sculpture. So that's another kind of thing about this sculpture that makes it very Renaissance, even though you might not think it immediately. And finally, the lack of idealization, which is something that separates, I suppose, the Renaissance from the Greeks and the Romans. Greek and Roman sculpture is very idealistic, almost romantic. It's so perfect. Whereas Renaissance artists, I mean, Michelangelo is a bad example because his figures are so perfect. But other sculptors, I think you'll start to see imperfections. I mean, this is an extreme example, but they were much more humanistic, and that included kind of an interest in human flaws and ugly things. And yeah, it's what makes it a more interesting period, I think. Okay, but, oh yes, this is a Renaissance sculpture, we have gathered that, but what about the women? The Renaissance is oh, actually, I included this, sorry, another tangent, but I included this sculpture on the left, which was included in an exhibition recently, to show you, which was a very provocative sculpture, to show you that even today, people are so uncomfortable with naked representations of aging, which just makes this 1400s sculpture of women even more radical, and honestly, one of my favorite, most unexpected Renaissance sculptures. Like, for me, this really trumps Michelangelo's David and tells you more about the period, to be honest. So, and I just came across it randomly in Vienna. You can go and see it in the National Museum. Anyway, back to, oh God, I really went on a tangent here. I'm sorry, I'm really interested in art historical representations of aging. And at the time that I made this, I wanted to include this hilarious Max Factor advert, this very vintage 1950s advert, which kind of has these three aging women and is an interesting parallel. Same kind of approach, giving you two very different messages. So it's up to you to make up your mind. This would be an interesting comparative essay as well. Anyway, finally, onto the question I wanted to ask, which is, where is the women? Where is the women? Where are the women? When, you know, we've talked about the feminist movement in the 1970s, something that came out of that is that a feminist historian called Joan Kelly wrote a very famous essay, which is online, you can read it, in 1977 called "Did Women Have a Renaissance?" And it basically argues that we have this historical period called the Renaissance, which we think defines human history, this super important moment, which it was for various reasons, but only really for men. It was not a Renaissance for women, you know. And actually, if anything, this was a negative turn for women, because as artists became more sure of themselves and started considering themselves professional, you had the establishment of art academies in Rome and in Florence and eventually in France, and even the Royal Academy of Arts in London, you know, all following this tradition of professional artists. And, you know, women weren't allowed in any of these academies. So this transition from craftsmen to artists completely left women behind. And all of the works of art that, well, all of the forms of art that women were still allowed to engage in, like textiles and ceramics and dressmaking or whatever it was, were no longer considered art, because the Renaissance created this such strict definition of art, which was basically painting, sculpture, architecture. So this was not a good time for women. Artemisia Gentileschi at the National Gallery now is often like, she's, you know, held up as the exception. She was the first woman to enter the Florence Academy of Art, but she, even she is like a 1600s artist. She doesn't really fit the Renaissance brief. But I'm still so happy that she exists in history. I mean, it's just amazing. It's such a feminist, she's a feminist icon just for making images like the one you see on the screen now. Like, you could not ask for anything better to be included in women's history. It's just unreal. But nonetheless, the point still stands. I wanted to only touch briefly on women so that I can talk about something that's happening now in art history more recently, more importantly, and kind of more relevantly, which is actually talking about race in the Renaissance. Because this is another thing that we haven't talked about so far. All of the images that we've looked at have been white, like of white people by white people. And it's just not an accurate representation, actually, of what Europe was like at the time. And it's, you can see that in Renaissance art. Like, even Dürer, who we've talked about, did studies and drawings of Black figures. But it's just that Western art history has kind of erased anything about race from the Renaissance, even though it was a period in which people were interested in race. This exhibition that you're looking at on the screen now is an amazing exhibition, and I gave the catalogue as one of the optional readings, and highly recommend. So I'm going to read from my notes now, just to give you a kind of summary of what the exhibition said. So the catalogue begins: the value placed on identity and perspective of the individual may be one of the greatest legacies of the European Renaissance to Western culture, but that attention did not expand to include marginalized groups, like women, for example, like Black people, for example. So, okay, I have in my notes that, you know, I've already said how this isn't necessarily a case of Black people not being there in the Renaissance or women not being there. It's really a case of how historians have remembered the Renaissance and just chosen to overlook this facet of the history. And one of the best examples of this strange overlooking is in this painting here. This is not a Renaissance painting. This is from the 19th century. We've talked about this painting before. It's a kind of realist impressionist painting by Manet. The reason why I included this is because in an exhibition last year, the Black woman in this painting was finally named. And the curator basically made this amazing argument where she was saying, this is one of the most famous paintings in the history of art. Hundreds of art historians have written about this painting, and yet no one has ever written about the fact that there is a Black woman literally front and center in this painting. Who was she? Why was she there? What is this telling us about European history at the time? I mean, no one looked. And that's exactly, oh God, this exhibition was so good. This is just some snippets, honestly, highly recommend the catalogue. But it was a 19th century exhibition. But nonetheless, the point, it's exactly what happened in the Renaissance. There are Black people in the Renaissance and no one looked at them, basically. If you look at paintings like this, there's Black people everywhere in this square. It's a mixed image racially, and no one talked about it. So I'm going to basically give you some of the reasons why the Renaissance was more diverse than you think. Yeah, this is another example that we'll look at. So firstly, the Romans and the Greeks had extensive trade with Africa, which they called simply Ethiopia. And therefore, oh no, this is point number 2. Okay, starting again. So there was extensive trade with Africa at this time, And therefore, there were Black Europeans, because there had been extensive trade between the European and African continents from the classical period. I mean, it goes way back. So there was actually such a thing as a Black European in the Renaissance, even though Renaissance art historians might not have led you to think so. Secondly, and very, very, very interestingly, the Renaissance fascination with Africa, so this inclusion of Black figures and this, sculptures of Black figures, was actually an attempt to revive the Greek and Roman fascination with Africa, which they called Ethiopia. So the Greeks and the Romans made lots of sculptures of Black figures because of the extensive trade links and networks that they had. And some people have written that these figures are objectifying and derogatory, but actually, I've included this image because on the side you can see that it says Kavos, which actually means beautiful. So they might, we have to make sure that we don't look back on these images superimposing contemporary beliefs about race onto 2,000 years ago, So, these are just some Greek and Roman examples, and you can, see that that Renaissance artists were trying to revive this fascination with the Black figure as well. And as I mentioned, obviously, at the time in Europe in the 1400s and 1500s, just like in the Greek and Roman times, there was increased trade with the African continent. So I'm going to read my notes again. So from the 15th century onwards, diplomatic, political, and commercial contacts between European and African rulers became more established, increasing in number and importance, and the dispatching of ambassadors became routine. In the 15th century, the Portuguese started trading slaves in West Africa. And it would be another century before Blackness became fully associated with slavery in the way that it did. But this is kind of like its beginning. And the reason why I say that is because we can't totally romanticize Renaissance and Greek and Roman representations of Black figures as if they were this kind of pre-racial injustice time. We can't say that really. There is this engraving, this woodcut, from 1548 called The Impossible, which shows two white men trying to wash an Ethiopian man. And it's this horrible stereotype that then came up later in 19th century advertising. So even though they certainly had very different understandings of or creations of racial hierarchies in the Renaissance, and they definitely included Black figures and had a kind of fascination with all types of human figures, this is the moment nonetheless where the foundations of what would become a massive system of racial injustice were laid. So you can't wholly romanticize it. It's complicated, which is also what makes it so interesting, basically. I just wanted to include these later, high Renaissance portraits. You can see they're very, very developed. But you can also see that they start to incorporate Black figures, which is a trend that would, I've included Manet's painting again, a trend that would continue up until the 19th century, and like I said, the foundations for this style of portraiture were laid in the Renaissance. So yes, there were Black figures in the Renaissance, often in, celebratory ways that you wouldn't expect, being represented as the Three Kings, for example, or as traders, but increasingly in ways that were racist and would kind of continue from this moment onwards. And actually, Manet's Olympia that I just referred back to is it's copying the pose of one of these famous Renaissance paintings, these reclining nudes. And there is a part of me that wonders whether he's purposefully making that connection to get people to think back to the Renaissance and realize that this is the trend that he's looking back to. And yeah, I wanted to actually finish, I suppose, with this turning point when you're in the 1600s now, when the Black figure changes. It doesn't have any more of the kind of richness and ambiguity of Black representation in the Renaissance. It becomes very firmly associated, well, Black figures become very firmly associated with slavery, like in this very early monument that you're seeing here. And I thought it would be nice to kind of round that off with Kehinde Wiley, because one of the things that he does, as I've said a million times in this class, is try to place Black figures back into the Renaissance in a really celebratory way. So he puts Black men in the poses of these traditional Renaissance paintings. And I think it really helps to understand his approach if you realize that Black people were always in the Renaissance anyway, and it helps you understand just how clever it is what he's doing, I think. So just to round off with a quote, from the exhibition catalogue, because it will explain it much better than me. I will read this to you. So in the 1600s, the focus of European attention shifted towards the Americas and Asia, while the ever-increasing demands for cheap labor, especially in new colonies, meant that slavery became specifically associated with Black Africans as it had not been in the past. The exotic otherness of Africa, the novelty, became simply other, and more commonly, the subject of exploitation. So, yeah, I wanted to end with that because I don't want to simplify Black presences in Renaissance Europe, but I want you to look for them in Renaissance paintings, because you will more than certainly find them, and it's super, super, super interesting. So I can see some questions already coming in.